picking up on the four cardinal virtues, remember, which are the four, we could say, traits of happy people for the Greeks. We've talked about temperance, which is a control and moderation of physical pleasure. Next, I want to talk about courage, which concerns fear and having just the right amount of fear. Now, what Aristotle is saying about courage is that we could apply this to what is very common to most students today, and most people in general, is anxiety. Anxiety is a kind of fear, and they're related to one another. And Aristotle's solution to this would be courage. And it's not that different from, as I mentioned earlier, something like cognitive behavioral therapy, where you learn to push against and train your thoughts and recognize thought patterns, and or something in modern psychology called exposure therapy. And what Aristotle is saying, exposure therapy is when you're afraid of something, you slowly face it. So if you're afraid of getting on an airplane, you slowly, first you think about going to the airport, then you go to the airport, but you don't go in, then you look at a plane, and then you get on a plane, but get off, and eventually you're able to fly. Exposure therapy, that is, you courageously, basically you develop courage to defeat anxiety. And this is a modern psychological idea, and shown to be somewhat effective. Basically, you face your fears. You have courage toward your fears. And this is what Aristotle means by courage, that it's feeling fear, but acting despite that fear, okay? It's sort of forcing and faking it until you make it. And eventually, Aristotle thinks you can habituate yourself to control your fear, okay? Doesn't happen the first time, and sometimes you fail, but you can habituate yourself to control your anxiety, right? So imagine somebody who has a very terrible fear of public speaking. Well, the way you deal with that is not to never public speak. What you do is you slowly do it. You push through it, and eventually, through habituation, you defeat that fear. And you defeat that anxiety. Now, this is Aristotle's theory. I'm not saying this is correct, but it's something to think about. What if it were possible to face our fears like that? What if it were possible to dissipate our anxiety through habituation, through continual courage toward that anxiety? So it's interesting to think about that the cure for modern anxiety, and I don't mean, of course, that people shouldn't take pills and anxiety pills, especially if they're distressed, but it's interesting to think about, and it does seem to have some backing in modern clinical psychology, that what if it's possible to face your anxieties with courage and slowly overcome them? Something to think about. Now, there's the other thing I want to add about courage. Aristotle says courage ultimately has to do with one object in particular. Yeah, it has to do with fears of all kinds, and fear on the battlefield, fear before a fight or flight, anxiety in general before anything. But ultimately, courage has to do with death, which is, for Aristotle, the ultimate fear. Ultimately, courage has to do with the ultimate fear, death. In other words, courage has to do with how you deal with your own death. How do you deal with your own demise? Have you faced the idea of your own death? Do you face it recklessly and not care? Or do you avoid it at all costs and are excessively fearful of it? Having just the right amount of fear, having a healthy relationship with your own death, will determine your character, for Aristotle. Now, there's a lot of, again, pop wisdom about people who come close to or come to the brink of death and come back a changed person. Aristotle thinks there's something powerful about knowing you're going to die and having courage to face your own death, and having dealt with the fear of your own death, that will change your character in some sense. Again, to show how this was used or appropriated by Christians in the medieval period, Christian monks used to put on their desk a human skull, and when they would walk by one another in the hallway, they would greet each other by saying, "Memento Mori, Memento Mori," which means remember death, remember death. In other words, one should always what can we take from this? A virtuous person, for Aristotle, but then also the Christian tradition, is someone who's constantly aware of the possibility of their own death. Okay? You have the right attitude toward death. Not that you're obsessed with it and not afraid of it all and not thinking about it, but that you have just the right amount of fear, that you have a healthy relationship with it, that you've confronted it, and that you've dealt with it. Happy people, for Aristotle, recognize and know that they're going to die. Okay? And once we realize and have thought about and faced our own death, that will reorient our own anxieties and fears, for Aristotle.